I am ready. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Good afternoon. We're almost finished with this year, thank God. And next year is bound to be better. I expect within 10 days for all of us, and I mean all of us, to get vaccinated. I think they should have a rule here. If you don't have proof of vaccination, you can't live here. And I think that should be the same in the schools. Maybe we will find a small section of the United States where people who refuse to get vaccinated can live and move and stay, while the rest of us can, in fact, enjoy life again. I understand the very famous doctor who was advising us about herd immunity has now upped the figure. He thinks it will require around 75% of the population to be vaccinated in order for the herd immunity to work. But whatever it takes, I want it to work. I want it to work soon. I wanted to get out of my apartment. And if you don't want to, then you should go move to this place, wherever it is. It ain't here. We had a play once. It was either at Berkeley Rep or the Aurora, in which the subject of the play was a bunch of Berkeley people, typical, who were opposed to inoculation because they felt it caused autism, which is a rumored process, which is not true at all. But it was a very interesting play to show you how the mentality of some people can distort things. You know, we would have never gotten out of the cave. We of the West are different from the rest because we agreed back in the late Middle Ages on the scientific method, where if you could prove something, then you could repeat it and convince the rest of the community. And therefore you had people like Lavoisier, the great French scientist, who finally said to us, listen, this is no secret. Oxygen is H2O, and you can try it yourself and see that it is, and therefore believe. And it was with people like Lavoisier and other German, French, and British scientists who led the way to give us the scientific world we live in. And I want to live in it, not die in it. So if you don't want to get inoculated, go somewhere, but not to Piedmont Gardens and not to California. Maybe you could go with Mr. Trump down to Florida, but you can't stay with us. Now, you know that Mr. Biden will soon be with us. He's now president-elect. I think he'll make a fine president. You know, he's Irish by heritage, and he's also Roman Catholic. I was alive when we had our last Roman Catholic president, and people acted as if it was the end of the world. John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, he was about as Catholic as Marilyn Monroe, but he had been baptized. And at that time in my state of Virginia, my home state, you would have thought that the world was coming to an end. The Pope would surely move in from the Vatican to the White House and be controlling things. Stupid things were said. And now no one talks about it at all, as if it were a happenstance. And it just simply shows, I guess, that we have grown up. or something has changed. Maybe it's from the shock waves of the recent presidency that causes us to be tolerant of anybody would be better than what we had. Now, one of the first things that President-elect Biden could do when he is president is do something about this tragedy that has occurred, not just with the virus, that is a true tragedy, but this series of dreadful pardons that have been given. You know, once upon a time, there was a woman who inherited a newspaper, Kit Graham, and she inherited a very good editor. And he inherited two really good reporters, Woodward and Bernstein. And they wrote about Deep Throat and about what went on and who had said what to whom. And we got that finally in a film version, All the President's Men, starring Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman. Now, if we make that movie again about the Trump years, it will be called All the President's Criminals, because he has pardoned more people than any governor has convicted. And something has to be done to clean that dirty, dirty slate. And that would be easy enough to do. You could appoint a committee, a pardon committee, and that committee would overview all the requests for pardon and then could recommend a pardon or not recommend a pardon. Governors get these requests all the time. Gavin Newsom gets requests for pardons, accepts some, doesn't accept others. And that would help clean the slate of what looks like an active criminal gang at work, getting pardons for people who should never have been pardoned. And so it has been 4 years of this trifling with democracy, so that we are in sad, sad shape. Now, maybe we will correct that, and maybe we won't. I'm sure Biden is not looking forward to joining Trump in a race towards pardons. Also, I think that President soon-to-be Biden would do well to leave well enough alone. Yes, there have been criminal actions on the part of President Trump. And if they are to be looked at, they need not be looked at by the president. He'll have enough trouble, and he does not want to cause an internal revolution. You have to understand, if you didn't hear my last lecture, that a huge number of people actually voted for President Trump. And they would be agitated and aggravated if he were to be somehow brought to trial. Plus, there's a way out. The president faces a very tough judge, the judge from the Southern District of New York, better known as Manhattan. His name is Vance, like a former and also a relative of his, member of the White House staff years ago. And he's very interested in how someone who made a lot of money paid no taxes. And he doesn't think that's possible, nor does he think it's correct, nor does he think it's right, nor do I. So have Vance do the legwork, the law work, and move on into the things that really need to be done for the future, not to people out of the past. I mentioned that to you the last time, but I mention it again because if the cry, and the cry has been very loud for justice against Trump, it's been echoed in the New York Times, that cry for justice should go to a state, not a federal court, a state where no president can do anything about it. It's why we have state courts, to make sure the system works, to make sure that justice, you remember that? Justice is done. And if we get that done, and if this business of pardons gets cleaned up, then, of course, dear old President Biden can move to the very difficult problems. Now, I've seen some of you walking around in the garden area and near the fish tank, holding a copy of Harper's magazine, a wonderful magazine. And in that magazine is a big article about whether we even should have the current Constitution and whether we should have a new one. And it might be worth thinking about. Other countries get constitutions, new ones. In recent cases, they got them because they lost wars to the United States. And when the United States occupied them, like in the case of Japan, or in the case of Western Germany, we then nicely wrote them a new constitution. And it cleared up a lot of issues that needed clearing up. And so today you have Japan with a very famous constitution that our famous commanding general, who I then was the American Caesar, General of the Armies Douglas MacArthur, saw to it that they accepted. They had not much choice given that they were occupied by an American military force and their waters were controlled by a very large American naval force. And so you have a very famous article in the Japanese Constitution, Article 9, which forbids the Japanese to have an armed forces ever again. Now that is much debated, and today they get around it by building what they are allowed to build, which is called a self-defense force. But the Japanese self-defense force has grown larger than many people's navies, as they have tried to play a peaceful role, but a role as guardians in Northeast Asian waters. And well that they do, because we cannot and should not be the policemen of the world. And in the case of the Germans, it's the same. The German Federal Republic has a constitution that we wrote and, quote, gave to them. And in it, they also are restricted. Most of their armed forces of the German Federal Republic are dedicated inside of NATO. So they're part of a European-wide system to which the Germans are very, very big contributors. So in those cases, it's worked out. And in the future, one should hope that it could work out in other cases, because life will change and situations will change. And Biden would do well to share in that shared responsibility. He doesn't want to be the policeman of the world. In fact, one of the first things he can do is put an end to this very stupid fourth part of the Defense Department. When the Defense Act of 1947 was created, there was created a Secretary of Defense, a civilian, who was to rule over the Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Navy, and the Secretary of the Air Force, which was also created by that same 1947 legislation. And that's all there was. There you could argue, well, there's the Marine Corps, which was attached to the Navy, and then that really was all there was. But now, suddenly, in the last 4 years, someone came up with a brilliant idea of having a fourth big department, and it would be the Space Department. In other words, an agency within the Department of Defense that worked on space issues. Well, that's what the Air Force did for years and very successfully. And so I would strongly recommend that we not create more slots, as they're called in the Pentagon, for generals and vice generals and colonels, but we eliminate all those slots and we put the space business back where it belongs in the Air Force and move on as we had before the arrival of Trump. And this is not just because I'm opposed to almost everything Trump did, but I'm opposed to waste in government, and having a space department as large as any of the other defense departments is a total waste of money. And we don't need to waste any money because, in case you have not noticed it, the pandemic has not only broken us in spirit in many cases, but has bankrupted us. And the last thing we need is to spend money recklessly and wildly. And the last place is at the defense level. And if we spend money wildly, we ought to spend it on an issue that is really critical. And that is the fact that our dear, dear friend, Vladimir Putin, is spending a great deal of money cracking our codes. And it has yet to damage our security, but it's certainly a threatening issue. In some cases, people would say it's a cause belli. In other words, it's a cause for war. But the last thing I would recommend is nuclear war with the Russians. At the end, we'd all be dead, even if we won the good battle. I don't want to win that bad. I don't want to win that hard. I don't want to win at all. But I wish that someone would be able to convince Mr. Putin there is a better cause than the one he's fighting for. And one wonderful thing would be for Mr. Putin to go away. They do have elections, as phony as they are, and there might come a day when Putin has to go. And that'll be a glorious moment for the Russian people first and foremost. A taste of liberty for the Russians would do a great deal to bring more liberty and more peace for everyone. So Biden will be forced to face up to those issues. And he will do so, I'm sure, the best way he can. He, as I pointed out last week, is a very wise man when it comes to reaching out across the country to the best and the brightest. And this is not to point a woman just because she's a woman, but to appoint a very good woman who happens to be a very good administrator, who happens to be an excellent choice, and who accidentally happens to be an American Indian to the Department of the Interior. And the same goes for the man who was gay and ran for president in the Democratic rush and did not win, but now he's going to be in the cabinet also. Not because he's gay, but because he's a very good politician. And even Gavin Newsom, who is running a campaign to recall poor old Gavin. But in the meantime, Gavin had to find somebody to replace Senator Harris, who's now the vice president. And he did a very wise thing. He found a very loyal subordinate who is a Chicano. Yes, a Chicano, one of those people we're trying to keep on the other side of the border. And he will replace her as a senator. And he has much experience and is very good at what he does. And so these contributions that Biden is making, because he can't make them all himself, somebody has to run these large cabinet. I don't think you yet have grasped what I've been trying to tell you for a long time. This country used to be a tiny, teeny, weeny, nothing of a country. Talk about the third world. We were the definition of the third world. 13 little colonies lined up along the Atlantic seaboard, dependent totally on their connections to London, and therefore dependent on sea travel. That's what we were. We were really minor league. And modernity snuck up on us. We became very big, very quick, and very powerful. Just one president alone, one who's really controversial, Thomas Jefferson. 8 years as president. What did he do? Well, lots of things that were on the borderline of illegal. When he heard that the sneaky French were going to sell Louisiana territory, he bought it without asking Congress permission. It's a no-no. But there is a part of the American system that leans heavily on 17th and 18th century British political theory. The theorist is John Locke. And under John Locke's theory, the sovereign has a certain amount of prerogative. And given that governance in the 17th and the 18th century was slow to get started, if you had to come to London all the way from, let's choose, Manchester, it took more than a day. And so if it was an emergency, you could act. And then later, when the group was together, you could throw yourself on the mercy of the group. And if the group was Parliament and they accepted your explanation, then what you had done was legal. And so Jefferson is using the prerogative of the sovereign to buy Louisiana from Napoleon Bonaparte and add so much to our country. We added Louis' hometown of New Orleans. We added the whole Mississippi River, for the French had explored it and had claimed it. It was a mighty, wonderful thing that Jefferson did. Today, people seem to only remember him because of his affair with Sally Hemings. But before the affair, when he was president, and when he, in fact, well, let me give you a typical end of days. On the last day, Jefferson was president. He told his servant, who was not Black, to saddle up his horse. And the horse was saddled. And Jefferson said goodbye to everybody. And Jefferson got on the horse and rode all the way back to his home in Charlottesville. Now you can drive that in 4 or 5 hours, but he rode a horse. That's the kind of person he was and the kind of people we were. There was no Model T. There was no Telsa. There was just an old horse to take an old president back to his plantation home at Monticello. Now you can do it in a whiz. 3/4 of an hour, depending on the speed, you can be in Monticello, and you should go if you've never been there. Wonderful house, wonderful area. Jefferson's buried there. In his neighborhood are two other presidents. Madison is in Montpelier, and that guy, I'll always forget his name. Monroe is at Thousand Oaks. 3 presidents in 2 counties, neighbors, and riding to work on horseback. A different time, a different place. Now all we are concerned about is, did they own slaves? And if they did, take their name off every public building. Seems to me we have better things to do. I've got news for all the name changers. They're all over San Francisco. The mayor of Richmond, Virginia is an African American. I bet you didn't know that. And he is opposed to taking down the statues of Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. They're all along a long boulevard called Monument Boulevard. One of the reasons he's opposed is because he's now putting up statues to Black Americans who are also heroes. One was a very famous tennis star. So you see, it cuts both ways, and not everybody is of the same opinion. We'd spend our better time working towards the future than worrying about changing and rewriting the past. The past will not go away. Robert E. Lee, still buried at Lexington, Virginia, actually on the campus of Washington and Lee, and right next to the campus of Virginia Military Institute, VMI. And no one is planning to dig him up or move him away. One has to know something maybe about German history. There's a great German university at Göttingen. And at Göttingen, there was a great historian who said, each age has its own nearness to God, end quote. And if you want to change that, you're not writing history. You're writing current affairs. You're putting your thumb up to figure out which way the wind is blowing, and then you're blowing in the wind. But that's not history. So try and learn something from the Göttingen 7, they were called, or maybe 8. Famous historians who, in their own way, rewrote history. They went back and looked at ancient history. This one I'm talking about actually won a Nobel Prize for Literature. He wrote such brilliant history. And he looked at the work of Tacitus, the great Roman historian, and he realized what Tacitus was writing was propaganda. Tacitus' father-in-law had been governor of the Roman province of Britain, and his career had been ruined by the emperor. And so Tacitus wrote the history of the early Roman emperors with a great deal of bias in order to get even with this guy. Now, it'd make a good novel, let's say. It was, in fact, a very good novel. You know it as I, Claudius, turned into a wonderful TV series trying to get you to get to know Augustus Caesar and the Caesars that followed, to include their dreadful wives. If Caesars can be bad, Caesar's wives can be worse. And that's not history. And Tacitus knew what he was doing. He was trying to rip off his father-in-law. He wrote a better history of his father-in-law called Agricola. It's a great piece of Roman literature, telling the story of his father-in-law's years as governor of Roman Britain. And you can go to those places in Britain. You don't have to go to London. London is the beginning and the end of the world, just like New York isn't the beginning and the end of the world. Instead of going to London, Londonium, you could go to Bath, or Bath if you prefer. In Bath, all the hot springs that were there were found by the Romans, and they developed it as a resort town. So just as Pompeii, near Naples in the Bay of Naples, was a resort town, so Bath was a resort town. The Romans were big on taking group baths, peeling grapes, and drinking wine. Why not? If you rule the world, what else is there to do but drink a good wine? But that takes us far away from Mr. Biden and all the chores he has ahead of him. But it is worth realizing how small we once were and how much we depended on others. Let me give you another example. All of you know the Library of Congress is a wonderful building. If you've not been there, you must go there. Well, once upon a time, there was a Library of Congress, but there were no books. We didn't have any books. We didn't need any books. So we got some books by gift of another great Virginian, the same one who rode his horse all the way back to Charlottesville. Thomas Jefferson collected all the great books he could get his hands on during his long stay in Paris before he was president. And now he gave them as a gift to the nation and formed the Library of Congress, which is a wonderful gift. And then to make sure it stays wonderful, we created a system called the ISBN. It's a number that your book gets assigned by the Library of Congress. And in return for them giving you that particular number, you give them 2 copies of your book. So for my 3 books, I gave them 6 books. And in return, I got 3 ISBNs. And now the book can be ordered by ISBN and identified in the card catalog in order to keep the catalog from growing too big, because it is huge today, as is the Library of Congress, and as it should be. But once upon a time, it had 0 holdings. Then suddenly Jefferson made a gift. Then suddenly an ISBN was created, and suddenly all these books flow in to the Library of Congress. So you realize this, that we were 13 little nothings hanging on the seaboard. If you were very far inland, you were nowhere. You had a very hard time getting anywhere. Along the eastern seaboard, there are a bunch of rivers. Thank God for that. So that when the English first came for a first permanent settlement, they had settled earlier and it had been lost in the Lost Colony off of Carolina. They came the second time and they were told not to settle within sight of the ocean or the nearby bays because of the Spanish raiders, since the English were pirating against the Spanish, so the Spanish pirated against the English. So you were to find a river and go far enough up the river where you couldn't be seen and then put a settlement down there. And so in 1619, our forefathers went up the James River, named for King James. And they went far enough that they felt they were secure, and they put ashore and founded Jamestown. And there they found themselves meeting up with Indians. Remember when I talked to you about this land is not empty? Well, that Virginia wasn't empty. There was a chief there, Powhatan, and he had a very beautiful daughter named Pocahontas. Many people used to think that was a nickname for Elizabeth Warren, but it wasn't. It was a real name for a real Indian princess. And she married one of the settlers, John Rolfe. And she went with John Rolfe back to England to the court of King James so that the English could see these strange and wonderful people. And then she returned with her husband, John Rolfe, to Jamestown. They had a hard time, hard winters. They didn't have the Thanksgiving that was held up north, but they also didn't have the witches of Salem, which was held up north. If you were a woman, you'd much prefer to be down south, believe me. Burning at the stake is not pleasant. And so it was that we slowly grew. It wasn't just the James River. A little few miles north of that, on a country road that passed through a little town that became Virginia's new capital, Williamsburg, which has in it the greatest college in America, the College of William and Mary, my alma mater. Then you keep going north and you come to the York River and you come to the scene of the great battle of Yorktown, where George Washington, along with a French army under General Rochambeau and a French fleet out in the York River behind the English who were now trapped, and where they then surrendered, and where we, 2 years later in Paris in 1783, won on July the 4th, our independence. Glorious day, wonderful day. But there we were, still a small little nothing. Nowhere as important as the great civilization in Mexico, where Cortez had gone, or as important as the great civilization of the Incas in Peru, where Pizarro had gone. Just a little nobody in a little place that was going to grow into a somebody in a someplace. And so it was that modernity snuck up on us. And there it is knocking at the door of Mr. Biden. In the meantime, the current occupant, even he's down in Florida, is giving away most of the national parks, wanting them to be developed, just what we need, the development of Yellowstone, the development of all these great places that we have put aside in order to be able to know what we were once upon a time. Tragic set of circumstances. And maybe it can be undone. Let's hope so. Let us hope that as soon as he's in office, he can make these places national parks again, so that all of us can go to the Ahwahnee. If you don't know where the Ahwahnee was, you ought to look it up. One of those great places up in the Sierra where all of us love to go once we're vaccinated. And since all of us will be vaccinated or will be moved out of Piedmont Gardens for sure, and then moved out of Oakland, and then moved out of Northern California, and then moved out of Southern California, we need to be 100% vaccinated, 100% safe, and free, as Martin Luther King would say, free, thank God Almighty, at last. I think if I never see the inside of my apartment again, I will be delighted. I'd be just as happy to sleep down near the fish tank in the lobby. A new view, but it is what it is for right now. So what can I tell you that faces Mr. Biden more? One, I don't think his wife very much cares for his vice president. I think it was very unfortunate that she decided to pull the race card. It got her nowhere. She certainly didn't win. She also wasn't my candidate, so it's easier for me to say. The candidate I liked very much and admire very much and still do, and still hope that she can pull off a miracle in Georgia. The miracle will be 2 Democratic senators winning in the upcoming election. Her name is Abrams. She's a wonderful, wonderful woman. And I have a very good friend who happens to be African American. Her name is Phyllis Champion. And she's moved back. It's so funny to me how many African American friends I have who've moved back to the South. She's moved back to old Savannah, bought herself one of those big old Savannah homes right there in one of those big old city parks. They're actually not big because there's many of them. They're just little squares like the English have. And Phyllis, I'm sure, is going to vote for these 2 Democrats. And if enough do, and according to today's news, the 2 Democrats are a couple of points ahead. We will at last own the U.S. Senate. Now, that's good news for national. Unfortunately, in California, there is something about Orange County that I never, ever will understand. But I think they think that it's anti-religious to vote against the Republicans. So they have recently scored again and have put Republicans back in. But at least we have, at the state level, put a Democrat in. By the way, I don't think any of you have noticed, but I'm wearing one of my famous Irish shirts. And this, you can't read it all. It says, "To the tallest leprechaun in America." And that's in honor of Mr. Biden's connection to the Emerald Isle. The Irish are back. This time, I hope we do better justice. Although if I didn't tell you at the beginning of this lecture, you should never have worried about John Fitzgerald Kennedy and the Pope, when in fact, Kennedy was elected, he was heard to say, "Oh God, this now means Mass every Sunday." And it did until that fateful day in Dallas. And we want none of that for the future. It would be such a long, difficult struggle as it is to get ahead of the game again. We're broke. In the last minutes before he flew off for Christmas in Florida, what a horrible part of Florida that must be. He finally agreed to pass legislation to help, one, to keep us in business, since otherwise we would have to close down the government, and also to pass the legislation that would pass on billions of dollars to all those people who are broke, right now broke, not in the future broke, but broke now. so that they can struggle forward. Today I thought about that because I sold my car today, if you can believe that. I decided I was too young to be driving around California. Besides, I can ride Lyft if everyone else can ride Lyft. So I sold my car. And then an agent called me from the Russian River, that's up near Summer Home Park, and I'd sold my house, a house I dearly loved, next to some wonderful, wonderful people, Candy Walker, Maureen Barton. You notice that most of them are women, but I can't help that. And so Mr. Biden will have his, you are aware that there were a few Catholics in this country at the beginning. The British Queen at the time had many problems, but she didn't want to add to those. So she made a very famous statement, quote, "I shall not make windows into men's souls," end quote. And so she left intact the Great Duchy of Norfolk. The Dukes of Norfolk today are Roman Catholic. And she allowed Catholics, and later she had no children, so her adopted son, the real son of Mary Queen of Scots, the woman she had had beheaded, James I of England, James VI of Scotland, he allowed Catholics to settle in the colonies. So there was a Catholic royal, at least Catholic noble, I should call him, Lord Baltimore. You've heard of Baltimore. It's a very, very nice big city on the Chesapeake Bay and is a seaport, so that Maryland, which did have Catholics in it, could quickly go by sea back to the mother country, England, and stay part of the process of connecting. And nearby areas also, Delaware, tiny, tiny Delaware, which Biden knows very well. These, we used to joke in Virginia about Delaware. It was to us the Duchy of the DuPonts, because there had been a Frenchman years ago, and he had decided to sell gunpowder to George Washington, who was in desperate need of gunpowder at places where he was trying to hold together a force, like Valley Forge. And so this duchy got to be quite well known. It gave us a very famous family, the Duponts. The Duponts were initially French, as you can tell by the sound of that name. But they were chemists, and chemists can make black powder. And so it was that the Duponts made a fortune. DuPont is a well-known name. Is a friend of mine, a Frenchman, Jean-Francois Paquelin, and he knows this family name well because he works for them. And in the process, there came to be a very famous DuPont woman. And she bought a very famous house. Virginians are very particular about their historic homes. And this was Montpelier, the home of the great Madison. And Dolly had left it once he died and gone back to Washington to live off Lafayette Square, across from the White House. So the house sat there, and this DuPont woman bought it. She collected, of all things, racehorses, Kentucky Derby winners. And when they finally went to horse heaven, she had them buried in the front yard of Madison's ancestral home. And as time went by, and she redecorated the place in very bad taste, she collected a man. Women do that. This man was known as Randolph Scott, the cowboy hero from Hollywood. And she did everything to make him happy. She tore up the living room and put in a swimming pool because he liked to swim. He stayed around a year and ran back to Hollywood to Cary Grant and all the rest of the people he ran with. And then the FFVs, the First Families of Virginia, gathered together, raised the money, bought the home, and it, like Mount Vernon, Monticello, Montpelier, and on it goes, is now within the Virginia Historical Society, never to be bought by a DuPont woman to be given to her Hollywood lover, but be given to the people of the United States as part of a heritage of which we don't have much, so we should take care of what we've got. And I think that's what our friend, likely to be president for only 4 years, he's not what you'd call young, but likely to make reforms that are badly needed. We need to reform the disaster known as the pardon system. We need to think about rewriting the Constitution, getting rid of all these excess things that are worthless. We got this document from a group of old men, one young man, Tom Jefferson, meeting in Philadelphia. And they didn't all agree, particularly Benjamin Franklin. He didn't like this document that Jefferson was writing, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What the hell does pursuit of happiness mean? It should say at least life, liberty, and property. That's a man from Philadelphia for you. And property was a key word to the English. It was key to their greatest political document, 2 treatises on civil government by John Locke. And John Locke subscribed to the idea, which is as a little slogan, a man's home is his castle, as is a woman's home, her castle. And we know that today because even Harvard can reform itself. For many, many years, Harvard did not hire Jewish historians. And then they broke down and hired a brilliant historian, Bernard Bailyn. And Bailyn's great book is, quote, the ideological origins of the American Revolution, end quote. And Bailyn sees these as built on Lockean principles. And the key Lockean principle is the sacred nature of property, that you cannot deny a person their right to property. You cannot take property away from them without due process of law. All these are buried within the American system, and they are enshrined in certain important American books. And I can think of none more important for the revolutionary period than the ideological origins of the American Revolution by Bernard Bailyn. If you haven't read it, it's not impossible, it's not easy. Harvard historians don't write easy books, it's against their religion. But it has got a systematic way of viewing how it is that we came to be these strange and most difficult people, first along the Atlantic seaboard, then thanks to Jefferson, up and down the Mississippi River, the great highway, the middle of our country, and then onward to the Columbia River and the West, and finally to California, making us who we are and what we are today. And Biden will want to make sure he treasures this and shows us the road to the future, not to the past. No, not a road to revenge. If we're going to leave Biden in control of the country, we need to leave Trump alone. If he is going to be looked at by a legal system, it should be the state courts of New York. And the issue should be income tax. Who ever heard of not paying any income tax? I should be so lucky. I don't know if I told you, but today I had two great successes. I sold my car and I sold my house on the Russian River. Hooray for me. And they are already asking for the taxes, the taxes, the taxes. You're supposed to pay them. And when you make hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars, it's impossible to assume that you made no taxable income for all the many years, not just 1 year, not just 2 years, not just 3. You are Mr. Non-taxable. Well, Mr. Vance would like to look at that. And that's a just cause. And it's a cause that has nothing to do with the presidency. It's a cause that has nothing to do with our soon-to-be president being involved. Nor can he pardon. You cannot pardon at the state level. You have to get a really big crook. And then sometimes you get one who wasn't that bad. I know many people think that Nixon was the end of the world, really bad. Well, let me tell you that he gave you détente. Détente. And he gave you rapprochement. Rapprochement was a return to friendly relations with China. Détente was to reestablish relations that were workable with the Soviet Union. Those are massive achievements, and Nixon gave them to you. He also, I know you'll find this hard to believe, he signed the Environmental Protection Act, gave us the EPA. He didn't like it, but he didn't care anything about it. His forte was foreign policy. And what happened to the sewers and the water system in Iowa didn't bother him at all. But now we have nobody doing nothing with anything. So Mr. Biden certainly will find himself with a busy, busy platter, with lots of very talented people there to help him, with lots of allies cheering him on. I can't tell you the kinds of cards I get from my friends in France and Germany and Italy and Britain, how excited they are to have somebody who seems like a decent person in charge. Now, if the British can just get rid of a certain prime minister and somehow reverse exit, they would be a happier person. Anyway, I've run out of time again. Thank you for coming today, and thank you for listening. Good luck, and get that shot.